Shoulder Peak is labeled as Black Ridge on Google Maps, but I prefer naming it after the headwaters of the creek below its east face. For a Front Range Kananaskis Peak, it is strangely remote, and likely has very few ascents since John Martin made his FRA in 1975. Rather than take the more obvious, and lengthier, Little Elbow Trail from the east, Wheatsa and I decided to try a bike and hike approach via the Evan Thomas Trail from the northwest. This was likely not our brightest idea of the decade. We left the parking lot at 0700 and biked the first 5 kilometers or so pretty easily. Nothing was easy about lugging the bikes over flood-ravaged terrain and busted up tracks and trails for the next 5 or 6 kilometers. Finally, we dropped the bikes for good and walked a series of single-track and cut-line trails to the southwest access drainage of our peak. A wonderful ascent on slabs to a southwest ridge and then south ridge to the summit greatly improved on the first 4 hours of our day. Return was the same way. We had very little beta on the Evan Thomas Trail beyond the 6 to 7 kilometer approach folks used to access the much more oft-ascended Fisher Peak. I remembered the ride being rough but doable from previous 2 rides, but had no beta on its rideability after the 2013 floods wiped out so many decent approach trails and roads. I'll sum it up for you right now in case you're curious. Rideability beyond the Fisher Peak approach is a solid 0.1 out of 10, i.e. it's not at all. This trip is a rare case of me regretting pushing the ride further than any sensible humanoid would.
Oh, thank goodness.
The biking started out great. A wide, easy trail led up the creek, staying far away from it, which is why it's still there, I guess. After a steep section and only just over 5 kilometers into the trip, things got messy already. Honestly, I recommend leaving the bikes atop this section. Do yourself a giant favor, trust me. After descending to the creek on a rough trail, we ended up riding short sections of remaining track and road and trail that the 2013 floods didn't destroy. It was tough, but we were determined to find more rideable sections that would justify lugging the bikes all the way in. Unfortunately, the further we dragged, pushed, pedaled, and swore our 2-wheel steeds up the ruined set of trails and tracks, the more reluctant we became to admit defeat. This might sound stupid, and it obviously was in hindsight, but there is the concept of sunk costs. When it became exceedingly clear that the bikes were costing us way too much time and energy relative to what they were gaining us, we finally admitted defeat and left them in a wide section of the creek that was completely destroyed by the flood. We were roughly 7 or 8 kilometers in at this point, and then we changed our minds. Naturally, as soon as we dumped the bikes, we found ourselves across the ruined creek and hiking up a perfectly rideable road again. Damn it! We hummed and hawed, and once again the sunk cost bit us in the proverbial keisters. It wasted 15 minutes, but we went back for the bikes, and this time we were 100% committed to lugging them in until it was simply insane to take them further. In my mind, this would be the ascent drainage under the peak, and not a meter sooner. Yeah, that didn't happen.
Yeah, thank goodness we went back for the bikes.
After a decent ride and an okay section of old road, things took a turn. As you probably guessed by now, the turn wasn't a good one. It's all a blur as I read this trip report, a blend of shitty road, shitty trail, shitty creek crossings, shitty mud, and just plain shite. It was all shite, man.
Well, it's a true backcountry biking adventure. That's for sure.
Here's the irony. If we were just hiking, it wouldn't have been terrible at all. We've done far worse approaches. This one is all on trail, just not a very bikeable one. A trail runner or an experienced hiker would consider this a very easy and reasonable approach with a few muddy areas, some bugs, and a few water crossings. Pretty standard semi-obscure Rockies Valley trail travel. It was the bikes that made it feel so much worse.
Well, let's see how long it's rideable this time.
I don't remember many specifics, but I do remember dragging, hauling, pushing, riding, and carrying the bikes for what seemed like kilometers on end until Witsa finally threw in the towel. We've bike whacked before, but this was over the top, even for us.
Yep. Yep.
Once we finally left the bikes behind for good, the day became much more friendly again. Like I said already, the trail was in great shape for hiking and easy to follow despite the residual flood damage. Obviously, folks use this route for horses and hiking. It's maintained enough for those activities.
I think I stumbled upon it and looking for Andrew's thing up here.
We passed through a lovely meadow tucked under the imposing east and north faces of Mount Evan, Thomas, Potts, and Denny, hosting a large horse camp. Once through this meadow, the route did indeed become a cut-line track again. Bikeable? Meh. Sort of not. Soon we were tramping southeast down yet another cut line towards the bottom of our ascent drainage. 16.3 kilometers and just under 4 hours from the parking lot, we finally turned up the southwest drainage leading up to our objective. In a very good twist, the day was big time salvaged by an awesome ascent. The next 3 hours were about as good as front range scrambles get. The drainage was open with zero bushwhacking and plenty of cool creek scenery and slabs to keep things fun. After the lower creek ascent, we continued up slabs and ribs, gaining height very quickly and opening stunning views behind us to the Opal Range and Little Evan Peak and Ripsaw Mountain, surrounded by green alpine meadows and soaring rock faces. Eventually we cut over to our left, gaining the southwest ridge and scoping out the summit still high above to the north. As we popped out on the upper south summit ridge, the views of Fisher Peak, Romulus, and Remus were stunning. A small lake tucked at the headwaters of Shoulder Creek below completed the scene.
Wow. That is a big summit cairn. Black Ridge / Shoulder Peak. Wow.
Wheats and I agreed that if this route was easier to access, it would be a deservedly popular one. As it stands, it never will be, but that's okay too. With clouds building and rain in the forecast for the afternoon, we started slowly back down the summit ridge. Descent was quick and easy. We found more scree than slab on the way down. This really is a fantastic ascent once you've done the approach. Slab on the way up, scree on the way down. It doesn't get better than that for a scramble. We hit the return trail less than 3 hours after leaving it, proving that the ascent route is very efficient. The return was predictable if nothing else. We hiked easily back up the cut line and then the single track to the bikes. Things weren't easy from there. I was frankly surprised by how stubborn we were on approach and just what kind of mess we managed to get the bikes through. I do remember that I referenced my Mount Burns trip more than a few times on approach. Unlike that trip, however, this one didn't pan out quite as fortuitously. Oh well, sometimes you lose, and this was one of those times. We completed the trip with a fast and fun 5-kilometer ride back to the parking lot, arriving 9.5 hours after leaving. Not bad, certainly quicker than Ephraim's 14 plus hours, but he didn't bike at all. Immediately after completing the trip, I felt flustered with it. I thought it was messy and not really worth it. Going through my photos and video a few days later, I realized that actually it was a wonderful adventure. Not all expeditions work out as neat and efficiently as planned. Our bike until you cry mantra was bound to bite us eventually, and this was one of those times. Who cares? That's what it's all about. Nobody actually thinks plodding up and down all these piles of scree is worth anything, do they? It's all about getting out and experiencing another day of unknown trails, valleys, creeks, and beautiful landscapes in the Canadian Rockies. And if that takes a little blood, sweat, and tears every once in a while, it only makes the results that much more satisfying.